Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I want to thank the Prime Minister for taking my advice and meeting with Mr. Coder. This is an issue about the national economy, and it's about jobs for all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, there are actually other projects, though, that can create jobs. For example, if the Liberals would allow the expansion of the Toronto Island Airport runway, Bombardier would have a big new customer for their made-in-Canada C-Series jets, and it wouldn't cost a cent. Why is the Prime Minister standing in the way of aerospace jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Leader of the Opposition for the question. It allows me to repeat that we took an undertaking during the last election to the people of Toronto who care about the development of their waterfront that we would not reopen the tripartite agreement. And we have kept that promise, and we're very proud of it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Defence Minister said in November that Canadians needn't fear ISIS. But since his comments, we've had ISIS-inspired jihadist attacks in Paris, in Istanbul, in Beirut, in Jakarta, where 1 Canadian was killed, and in Burkina Faso, where 6 Canadians were murdered by terrorists. Does the Prime Minister agree with his Defence Minister that ISIS is not a threat to Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, as I stated, the threat of ISIS is real. But however, as leaders of the nation, we need to give confidence to our Canadians that our institution, our security services will protect them, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to ISIS, the Prime Minister does not back his own words on diversity with action. One of the greatest threats on the planet to cultural and religious freedom, to the rights of women, to the rights of gays and lesbians is the Islamic State. So it's one thing to give speeches on diversity from a Swiss ski resort. It's another to fight for the people whose lives are threatened by terrorists and murderers in Iraq and Syria because of their diversity. How can the Prime Minister say that he cares about diversity but then leave the fight for others?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
In fact, Mr. Speaker, with the plan we are preparing, Canada will be stronger to support our coalition to fight this terrorist group, the so-called Islamic State. We will do it with pride and courage, as Canada must do everywhere in the world when it's the time to fight terrorism.
L'honorable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, on est bien content de voir que le Premier ministre a donné suite à notre recommandation d'hier et que ce matin, il a pu rencontrer son bon vieux chum libéral. Mais on souhaite, Monsieur le Président, que le Premier ministre ait parlé d'économie et du projet du pipeline qui va créer 3 000 emplois et avoir des retombées d'1 milliard de dollars. Monsieur le Président, le Premier ministre est député de Papineau, donc de Montréal. Dans ce gouvernement, il y a des Québécois. Est-ce que ce gouvernement s'engage à défendre l'économie du Québec en proposant et en faisant la promotion de ce projet bon pour l'économie du Québec et du Canada?
L'honorable ministre des Ressources naturelles.
Mr. Speaker, we will defend the economic interests of all Canadians, whether they live in Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Quebec, or Newfoundland. Mr. Speaker, the building of major infrastructure projects is very important to the Canadian economy as we look at ways of moving our natural resources sustainably to tidewater, Mr. Speaker. This is the message that we have been giving to Canadians regardless of what region in which they live.
L'honorable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le Président, est-ce que le gouvernement est conscient que ce projet-là va permettre d'alimenter les 2 raffineries pétrolières que nous avons au Québec? Est-ce que ce gouvernement est conscient également que ce projet-là, va pouvoir aider l'industrie pétrochimique du Québec? C'est 70 000 emplois sérieux, bien rémunérés au Québec. Monsieur le Président, est-ce que le gouvernement s'engage à parler haut et fort pour l'économie du Québec?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we are aware of how important the natural resource sector is in Canada to creating jobs. We also know that at the moment, There are particular regions in the country that are hurting because of job losses, because of commodity prices, in particular in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and as my colleague has just said, also in New Brunswick. And we're also aware that major projects are good for the country, but they must carry the confidence of Canadians.
The honourable member for Outremont.
Mr. Speaker, today the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal issued a scathing decision confirming the systemic discrimination against First Nations children and families that continues to this day. Will the Prime Minister act immediately to right this wrong by instructing the government lawyers not to appeal today's decision, and will he commit to the necessary funding in the budget so that we can begin to reverse this history of discrimination, colonialism and racism in Canadian institutions?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, we want to acknowledge the decision of the tribunal today, acknowledge the leadership and advocacy of Cindy Blackstock and the Assembly of First Nations and Indigenous Peoples. It's a 180-page document. Certainly we will take careful reading of it, but understand and recognize that there will likely not be any reason why we would seek judicial review of this decision. We can and must do better, and we will renovate the child welfare system in this country.
Likely, there is no reason to appeal this decision. Today as well, Environment Commissioner of Canada lambasted the current regulatory system for pipelines. Now, during the campaign, the Liberal leader made a very clear commitment to overhaul the environmental assessment process, and he promised that new regulations would apply to, quote, existing projects as well, and that the entire assessment process of current projects would have to be, quote, redone. Are the Liberals going to respect that very clear promise to change the rules and make sure these assessments are redone?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to answer my first question as representative of the residents of Ottawa Centre. We are committed to rebuilding the trust of Canadians in our environmental assessment process, trust that was lost under the previous Conservative government. But as part of that, we will be informing our decisions through consultations with Canadians. We will be basing our decisions on evidence and science in consultation with Indigenous people and with input from the public. We will also be considering the impact of climate change. Thank you.
The minister didn't answer the question. Rebuilding the trust begins with keeping your promises. C'est pas ça qui a été promis lors de la campagne électorale. 2 fois plutôt qu'une en campagne électorale, le chef libéral a promis que l'ensemble des vérifications et des évaluations environnementales sur les oléoducs au Canada devaient être refaits au début. Pas question de faire du patchage d'un item ou d'un autre. Est-ce que oui ou non, ils vont respecter leur promesse de refaire les évaluations environnementales?
Honorable ministre de l'Environnement.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Un des engagements que nous avons pris comme gouvernement était de rétablir la confiance des Canadiens dans les processus d'évaluation environnementale. Ceci est la seule façon d'acheminer nos ressources vers les marchés d'une manière responsable dans le 20e siècle. On va le faire.
The Honourable Member for Outremont.
Autre tentative de changer de sujet. L'engagement, la promesse en campagne électorale, c'était de refaire les évaluations environnementales dans Kinder Morgan, dans NRJS, et le gouvernement est en train de reculer là-dessus aussi, Monsieur le Président. Par ailleurs, autre engagement, c'est d'aider les gens qui ont le plus besoin. Savez-vous que seulement le tiers des Canadiens sont admissibles à l'assurance-emploi lorsqu'ils perdent leur job? Les conservateurs ont fait défaut de ramener le seuil à 360 heures. Est-ce que les libéraux vont agir devant cette situation critique et garantir
Madame la ministre du Développement social.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to be able to respond, to indicate to the House and all Canadians that we're in an active review of employment insurance standards and will maintain and honour our commitments during the election.
The member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, the UN recently put out a report that found that ISIS is holding close to 3,500 people in captivity as slaves, mainly from the minority Yazidis community. ISIS is responsible for nearly 18,000 deaths and the displacement of over 3 million Iraqis alone. Previous governments have acted on the United Nations responsibility to protect. Yet we see no plan at all from this government to stop the genocide in Syria and Iraq. Why is the Prime Minister outsourcing Canada's obligation to protect the innocent?
Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
I want to reassure my colleague it's the opposite that we will do. We'll fight very strongly against the so-called Islamic State with determination for the reasons you just mentioned, and we'll do it in a more effective way than it was in the past. It's what we will do. We'll work with the coalition to be sure that Canada will add to the coalition and will not duplicate. We'll be strong and we will be resolute in supporting our allies.
Colleagues, I'm having a little bit of noise from certain side. If we could have less of that, that'd be good. Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of National Defence said in a radio interview of our allies, of course they want us to keep our CF-18s there. So, Mr. Speaker, our allies want us to leave our CF-18s in the fight against ISIS. Canadians want us to leave our fighters jets in the fight. Why are the only people who want us to stop bombing ISIS the Prime Minister and ISIS?
The Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, one of the most important things when dealing with a conflict like this is to get a good situation of what's happening on the ground. We can actually see, because they didn't have a good assessment of the situation, why we're actually in this mess. And so that's why I'm taking the time to do a thorough assessment of making sure that we get this right and we have the appropriate capability that's going to actually make it more effective. I've done this in the past and we'll do this again. Thank you.
The honourable member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Mr. Speaker, there was a report today that indicates that when the Prime Minister met with Vladimir Putin in Turkey, they both expressed a desire to normalize relations. But that's not what we heard from the Prime Minister when he reported to Canadians in the aftermath of that meeting. Now we hear Russia's foreign minister who wants Canada to ease up on its unwavering support for the people of Ukraine. Why is the government of Canada turning its back on the people of Ukraine? Why is the Prime Minister playing footsie with Putin?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, Canada will always be there for Ukraine. We do not accept the interference and invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and we'll find the most effective way to say that to the government of Russia.
The honourable member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Monsieur le Président, il a été rapporté que Bombardier tente de faire affaire en Iran en dépit que le Canada ait les sanctions strictes en place. Les sanctions sont là pour les raisons légitimes, pour ces menaces concernant l'existence d'Israël et son support au terrorisme. Est-ce que, comme Bombardier, sait quelque chose que le reste du Canada ne sait pas? Le gouvernement a-t-il déjà levé les sanctions contre l'Iran?
L'honorable ministre des Affaires étrangères.
Monsieur le Président, il est vrai que les Nations unies demandent au pays de retirer les sanctions qui sont liées à l'accord conclu pour s'assurer que l'Iran n'utilise pas le nucléaire pour des raisons militaires. Alors le Canada retirera ces sanctions, mais ce que le Canada maintiendra, c'est une méfiance envers un régime qui ne doit pas retourner dans l'armement nucléaire, un régime qui est un danger pour les droits humains, qui n'est pas un ami de nos alliés, notamment Israël. Alors c'est avec les yeux ouverts que nous allons agir en conformément aux Nations unies.
Bravo.
The honourable member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, Iran has a long history as a bad actor
in the Middle East. Iran provides military assistance to the Assad regime in Syria. Iran's supreme leader routinely threatens the destruction of Israel. And, Mr. Speaker, reopening our Canadian mission in Tehran would put Canadian foreign service workers at risk. So, Mr. Speaker, will the government abandon plans to normalize relations with Iran and keep sanctions in place?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, with the misleading approach of the former government, Canada is not there in Iran, and it's not good for the people of Iran. It's not good for the promotion of human rights. It's not good for our strategic interests in the region. It's not good for Israel. It's good for nobody. Will change this policy.
That's it.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Well, and we've seen that Iran is very selective in the way it protects foreign diplomatic missions. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering today whether the Minister of Foreign Affairs is more willing today than yesterday to explicitly condemn the incitement by Palestinian leaders for deadly attacks against Israeli civilians. I wonder whether the Minister's reluctance has anything to do with his stated intention that Canada return to be an honest broker in the Middle East, a return, Mr. Speaker, to the discredited liberal philosophy of moral equivalence of Palestinian terrorists and Israeli victims. Will the Minister stand today and condemn the incitement?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Canada has been, is, and will always be a friend of Israel, Mr. Speaker. What will not happen anymore is the attempt of the opposition, of the Conservative Party, to make it a partisan issue in Canada.
That's right.
Député d'Abitibi-James, Nunavik, EU.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Tribunal canadien des droits de la personne confirme aujourd'hui ce que les communautés autochtones savent depuis trop longtemps. Les enfants des Premières Nations vivant sur réserve reçoivent moins d'aide que les autres enfants canadiens. Or, le ministère de la Justice a utilisé toutes les tactiques pour faire dérailler le processus et nier la réalité affectant tant d'enfants. Monsieur le Président, est-ce que la ministre de la Justice confirme aujourd'hui qu'elle ne portera pas en appel cette décision historique? Simple question, oui ou non?
L'honorable ministre de la Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. As I said, the judgment is 180 pages, and we are undertaking to do our due diligence and review that decision. But I cannot anticipate anything within that decision that will make cause for me to file for judicial review. This is about equality. Our government is committed to equality and committed to taking and assisting and working with First Nations to ensure that every child has the opportunity to succeed.
The Honourable Member for Timmins-James Bay.
Mr. Speaker, the eyes of the children in our Parliament today as they look to us to see how we are going to end the policies that have led to too many Indigenous families broken up, too many children denied access to everything from emergency dental care to proper wheelchairs. For Indigenous children in this country, this is how the system works. Government's balancing the books on children who are considered not worthy of protecting. So my question is to the President of the Treasury Board. This is a legally binding rule. What is his plan to weed out the systemic negligence that runs through all the key departments of the federal government? What is his plan for action?
Here. The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Affairs.
I thank the member for his question and for his advocacy. As you know, every member of this government, every minister has in its mandate letter the relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people as a very serious issue. The absolutely devastating report of the tribunal today we take very, very seriously, and all members of this government will work tirelessly to make sure to right the wrongs of the past and make sure that every Indigenous child in this country has an equal start in life.
The Honourable Member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Budget Officer is reporting that Canadian households actually carry the highest debt load in the G7. And they say this is of concern because it actually creates a situation where Canadians are more vulnerable to economic shocks, like losing their job. Now, this applies, Mr. Speaker, to Canadian households. It also applies to our country. Who is going to max out our country's credit cards on a spending spree? It's going to be the Finance Minister, Mr. Speaker. And why is this government abandoning any fiscal sense in the form of common sense?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie mon honorable collègue. Le gouvernement veut s'assurer que la situation financière des ménages demeure solide et que leur niveau d'endettement est gérable. Nous surveillons évidemment ce ratio, le ratio du service de la dette des ménages et beaucoup d'autres indicateurs. Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement a dernièrement pris une mesure afin d'aborder la vulnérabilité et les risques éventuels futurs des secteurs du logement en exigeant des mises de fonds supplémentaires. C'est la façon de travailler pour faire croître la classe moyenne, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
The Honourable Member for Milton.
This can't be a situation of do as I say, not as I do. They are clearly saying that there's a problem with respect to Canadian household debt, but they're failing to recognize that there's going to be a real problem with our country's debt if they're going to go on a fiscal spending spree. Mr. Speaker, one way to figure out what's going on in the country is to have Finance Committee pre-budget consultations as per the mandate of a parliamentary committee. None are on the horizon, Mr. Speaker. Very simple question for the government. Yes or no? Are we going to have a Finance Committee pre-budget consultation?
Secrétaire parlementaire au ministre des Finances.
Speaker, I'm very happy to report that with the Finance Minister, we went from coast to coast to coast. We met with thousands of Canadians. Canadians have asked us to invest in innovation, productivity, look at infrastructure and export. I'm pleased to report to this House that thousands of people have also made submission online. More than 120,000 people have interacted with us online. I'd like to say, Mr. Speaker, Canadians want us to invest in the economy, and it's exactly what we're going to do for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Brantford-Brant.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are losing their jobs. They're holding back investments and are on the edge about their financial futures. Yet all we hear are Liberal plans for massive spending, saying their deficits could go as high as $30 billion. Can the Finance Minister confirm that the Liberals still plan to target small business, including engineers, doctors, veterinarians, and other professionals, to finance his spending spree?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais rappeler à mon collègue, l'honorable collègue de l'autre côté, que nous avons hérité un déficit de plus de 150 milliards de dollars canadiens, Monsieur le Président, du gouvernement conservateur. Nous avons un plan pour faire croître l'économie, Monsieur le Président, et nous l'avons déjà amorcé. Avec notre mandat, nous allons respecter trois principes clés, Monsieur le Président. Nous maintiendrons le ratio de la dette sur un PIB sur une tangente décroissante. Nous gérons nos dépenses avec prudence et nous rétablirons l'équilibre budgétaire d'ici la fin de notre mandat. C'est ça de la gestion responsable, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
The Honourable Member for Brantford-Brant.
Mr. Speaker, we left a surplus in October 2015. Those are the words of the Parliamentary Budget Officer. It's clear. The Liberal plan is spend, spend, spend. This government has already gone after families and taken away income splitting, and they cut tax-free savings account and have signaled that they will take away tax credits from students, apprentices, first-time homebuyers, and families with children in sports and arts programs. How is the Finance Minister going to pay for his massive spending? Who is next on his hit list?
I'm starting to hear noise today from more than one side. That's not a good sign, but I know we'd rather have noise from no sides. If we could all cooperate, that would help. After all, this is a crucible of democracy. It's a place for vigorous debate. It's a place where ideas are tested, but the test of an idea is not how loud the applause is or whether it's a standing ovation, and nor is it whether it can withstand rude interruption. The test is time. So with that, let's go to the Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like first to apologize. I did not see that you were rising, so my apologies. I'd like to say to the honourable colleague who said there was a surplus, there was actually, Canadians do know, $115 million deficit that you left us. Mr. Speaker, we have a plan to grow the economy. En décembre, Monsieur le Président, nous avons déjà amorcé avec la réduction d'impôts pour la classe moyenne qui va bénéficier à plus de 9 millions de contribuables. Monsieur le Président, c'est une des mesures. Nous allons aussi mettre dans le prochain budget fédéral l'allocation canadienne aux enfants qui va bénéficier à 9 familles sur 10, qui va permettre à des centaines de milliers d'enfants de sortir de la pauvreté. C'est ça, Monsieur le Président, que les Canadiens nous ont demandé de faire, investir dans la classe moyenne, faire croître l'économie. C'est exactement ce que nous allons faire.
All right, the member for St. Albert Edmonton is a new member. St. Albert, let's see. Yes, that's right. New member, and some things not to learn from older members who've been here longer, and one of them is heckling. So let's try to avoid that. Member for the député de Rimouski, Nejet, Témiscouata-les-Basques.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le rapport de la commissaire à l'Environnement et au Développement durable a révélé de sérieuses lacunes dans le système de surveillance des pipelines. Tout d'abord, les plans d'urgence et le système de surveillance sont désuets. Elle a aussi révélé que le public est tenu dans le noir et pour couronner le tout, l'Office national de l'énergie ne s'assure même pas que les conditions imposées aux compagnies soient respectées par celles-ci. Monsieur le Président, comment est-ce que les Canadiens sont supposés avoir confiance au système? Quand est-ce que les libéraux vont réaliser que ça prend plus qu'un pansement pour corriger ce système totalement défaillant?
Bravo. Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I spoke to Commissioner Gelfand yesterday about her report, and I spoke to the chair of the National Energy Board this morning about her recommendations. I am assured by the chair that there will be instant action, as in fact it started actually quite some time ago, and it's the commitment of my department to monitor those actions to make sure that the Commissioner's recommendations are followed completely.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the minister might be a bit confused because the Environment Commissioner's report pointed out in black and white how flawed and, in fact, dangerous the current NEB process is. In more than half of the cases studied, the regulator doesn't even keep track of the conditions that they impose upon pipeline companies. This Prime Minister and his MPs made explicit promises to British Columbians, so let's now see if they'll actually keep them. Will this government demand that the National Energy Board review Kinder Morgan and Energy East under new and credible processes that Canadians can finally trust?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we have said that there will be a new process of transition for those projects that are currently under review by the National Energy Board. Mr. Speaker, we have been saying that those principles and the transition period will be announced in a number of weeks. I can now say it will be in a number of days.
Monsieur le Président, notre gouvernement s'est engagé à apporter des modifications importantes en ce qui a trait au fonctionnement du Parlement. Est-ce que le leader du gouvernement à la Chambre pourrait nous faire une mise à jour quant aux initiatives déjà entreprises et nous informer sur le plan d'action adopté par le gouvernement pour concrétiser les réformes souhaitées? Merci.
Le gouvernement en Chambre.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux remercier ma collègue de Brossard-Saint-Lambert pour sa question. Je rencontre régulièrement, comme vous savez, Monsieur le Président, les leaders de l'opposition en Chambre. Je peux même vous assurer qu'il y a une certaine amitié qui se développe. Hier, j'avais écrit au président du comité permanent de la procédure pour lui demander l'occasion de venir témoigner, partager nos idées avec nos collègues du comité. Il m'a informé récemment que je puisse même y aller jeudi de cette semaine. Alors, je demeure énormément confiant, Monsieur le Président, qu'avec nos collègues et l'appui des députés de la Chambre, on peut y arriver à rendre le Parlement plus efficace, mais aussi plus efficace en termes du travail et famille.
The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the minister showed that he didn't know that under our Conservative government, the first Keystone pipeline was approved and built, along with the Alberta Clipper, the Line 9B reversal, and the Anchor Loop. However, under this irresponsible Liberal government, the Keystone XL pipeline was rejected with virtually no pushback, no opposition from the Liberals, no concern as they laugh. But TransCanada isn't taking it lying down. In fact, it's challenging the U.S. decision at NAFTA. Simple question, will the government support this NAFTA challenge? Will they get behind it and be supportive of more jobs for Canadians?
The Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, at the time that the American decision was taken, the Prime Minister indicated that we regretted that decision from the government of the United States. We have also said that the decision to appeal it to a NAFTA panel is the business of the proponent and not of the Government of Canada.
The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Shame on the government. Their previous governments have taken on NAFTA challenges. Cool is an excellent example. This government should get behind jobs and opportunity and get behind this challenge. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the minister also said that the natural resources industry leaders have just come to the realization that Aboriginal and environmental concerns are important. Does his arrogance know no bounds? Energy East has done over 500 consultations since 2013. So we have a minister who doesn't know which pipelines were built in the last 4 to 10 years. We have a minister who doesn't understand the process, and a minister who won't get behind jobs in Canada. There's a lack of confidence in this minister already.
The Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, the confidence that really matters is the confidence of Canadians in the process that we're about to improve. And rather than playing politics with pipelines, rather than trying to pit one region of the country against another, Mr. Speaker, we are going to unite Canadians who will understand that the process that we are now in transition will be a much better process than was followed by this government.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister was wrong when he said his government is working hard to create jobs. There's one important nation-building project that will create thousands of much-needed, well-paying jobs across Canada. It's Energy East. While the government ponders vague regulatory changes, hundreds of thousands of Canadians ponder how they will pay their bills this month. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Natural Resources realize that his wavering doesn't instill confidence and creates an unstable environment for the whole economy?
Good question. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we have indicated that we understand the human consequence to job loss. We understand that the low commodity prices in the oil and gas sector and in potash has led to layoffs across the country, most recently in New Brunswick. We take that very seriously. And we also understand that moving forward, the best chance to create new jobs in the energy sector is to make sure that major new pipeline projects and other projects throughout the country have a regulatory process behind them that enjoys the confidence of Canadians.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta attracts people from all across Canada to pursue opportunities for themselves and for their families. But hard-working Albertans are hit by this energy sector downturn the worst, including thousands of people in Lakeland. On this side, we know that impacts all sectors and all Canadians. A strong Alberta means a strong Canada. Mr. Speaker, I am proud of Alberta's world-leading energy sector. When is the Natural Resources Minister or any of the 4 Alberta Liberal MPs finally going to support Alberta's energy workers who contribute so much to Canada?
Good point. The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Well, I thank the member for her question and her concern for Albertans, because I am, and the people I'm talking to, they're actually refreshed by the new approach of this government. We have a Prime Minister who's willing to engage with First Nations people. a Prime Minister who's willing to engage with premiers and other people on the ground to see that these projects get consensus. And I suspect she should come down to Calgary and talk to the people I'm not talking to. They're happy we're in charge.
Député de Jonquière.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La fin du livraison postale à domicile continue de mettre en colère de nombreux citoyens. Les nouvelles boîtes communautaires sont un vrai fiasco. Serrures gelées, boîtes inaccessibles et enneigées. Problème de sécurité. On a même eu des vols de courrier. Maintenant, les municipalités demandent l'obligation légale d'être consultées. Alors que le premier ministre a déjà renié sa promesse de rétablir le système de postal de livraison à domicile, la ministre peut-elle confirmer que les consultations seront ouvertes, accessibles et que la population ira dans tout, partout au Canada?
The Minister of Procurement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her question. And as we committed to in the election, we are going to ensure there is an independent review of Canada Post, which will look at whether or not there should have been installation of roadside mailboxes, which we had Canada Post put a stop to because Canadians were not happy with that initiative. We are going to ensure that Canadians are consulted from coast to coast to coast, and we will ensure that it is an independent task force that actually undertakes this review.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, the Transportation Safety Board is reporting more derailments, runaway trains, and violations of rail safety rules, including exhausted engineers. Following the Lac-Mégantic disaster, rail companies were required to report on potential risks, the locations, and how they're being addressed. During the election, this government promised to increase transparency, yet they're refusing to make public critical reports on rail risks from rail traffic. Will this minister today in this place commit to making public safety risks posed by rail operations across our nation?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for her question because rail safety is of paramount importance for this government. Recently, we took action against CP with respect to the issue of railway personnel fatigue. This is something that concerns us. There are far too many derailments occurring in this country. We have to improve rail safety. We are going to continue to work in that direction so that municipalities across this country feel that their rail system is secure. This is an undertaking from this government. Thank you.
The honourable member for Banff Airdrie.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the Liberals' so-called changes, the Senate needs real reform. But instead, the Liberals have announced an unelected, unaccountable board that will be making secret recommendations for an unelected Senate. This advisory board will meet in secret, provide a non-binding shortlist in secret, where the Prime Minister will then choose from the list or not in secret. So I ask the Liberals, why the secrecy?
Now the Minister of Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to announce on January 19th the appointments of the members of the Independent Advisory Board on Senate appointments, a critical step as the government begins the process of injecting a new spirit of non-partisanship in the Senate. The Advisory Board is led by the distinguished Canadian Order of Canada recipient, Huguette Lebel. The Advisory Board consists of a chair and ad hoc members for the provinces where the vacancies exist. We are confident that this process will lead to a less partisan and a more effective Senate.
The honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, everything about the Senate appointment process is secret. The secret list of candidates, secret advice is proffered secretly to the Prime Minister, who then uses Maxwell Smart's cone of silence to make his decision. Well, last year, an Angus Reid poll showed that 84% of Canadians, 84%, support either Senate elections or abolition. By contrast, in the same poll, 14% support appointments. So my question to the Minister is, does she believe that all these layers of secrecy will boost that 14% support level?
Now the Minister of Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians mandate us to bring real change to the Senate, and we're doing that without opening up the Constitution. The advisory board will be guided by a public, merit-based criteria in order to identify Canadians who would make significant contributions to the work of the Senate.
The honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Mr. Speaker, I've got a copy of the Supreme Court report ruling right here, and it does not mention secrecy or mandate or require it. Mr. Speaker, on the subject of electoral reform, the last time a government in Canada changed the electoral system without a referendum was 1951, when British Columbia's Liberal government calculated that a preferential ballot would favour them, and therefore imposed it on the province as a legally sanctioned way of rigging the 1952 election. Now, it didn't work for the Liberals then, thank goodness. They lost the election unexpectedly due to voter backlash. So, trying to change the system without a referendum didn't work in 51. Why do they think it'll work now?
Minister of Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to wish the member opposite a belated happy birthday yesterday, and remind the members of this House that the conversation we are going to have about this very important reform is going to be more complex than a simple yes or a no answer. It's more complex than that. We have a tremendous opportunity to examine a variety of ways to ensure that Canadians feel fully engaged and are able to participate in our democracy. That's why we've committed.
The honourable member for Brampton East.
Mr. Speaker, an overwhelming number of my constituents in Brampton East are frustrated by the processing times for family and spousal sponsorships, citizen applications, PR renewals, and visitor visas. Can the Honourable Minister of Immigration please inform this House of the current processing times and reassure Canadians all across this nation that our government will reform the immigration program to ensure that it's fair, transparent, and works for all Canadians?
The Minister of Immigration.
Speaker, I thank my colleague for his good question, and he's absolutely right that over the last decade the processing times for family members have mushroomed to the point where the situation right now is a mess. Even for spouses, the processing time is typically 2 years versus 4 to 6 months in other countries. So you will know, Mr. Speaker, that my very top priority as Immigration Minister will be to bring these processing times substantially down over coming years.
Honourable member for Grand Prairie Mackenzie.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this House, there's one person that knows something about conflict of interest, and it's the Minister of Agriculture. As a matter of fact, in 2002, he was forced to resign due to a conflict of interest. As a matter of fact, he was forced to resign as Solicitor General because it was found that the government had funneled money to the place in which his brother worked. Now, at the time, it was ruled that he, in fact, was in breach of his obligations. I'm wondering if the minister has learned from his past mistakes, if he'll stand in this House and admit that his current Chief of Staff is in a complete conflict of interest.
You bet. The Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Chief of Staff is extremely qualified for the job, and I'm proud that she has such a strong agricultural background. And I can assure my honourable colleague in this House that from day one, she was subject in my office to the Conflict of Interest Act, and she will also abide by any direction from the Ethics Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable député d'Albany-Salbary-sur-Loire.
Monsieur le Président, ça fait 4 ans et demi que le Catherine Spirit gît à Beauharnois, dans le lac Saint-Louis. Les élus et la population sont de plus en plus inquiets face aux risques d'incendie et de vandalisme puisque le bateau n'est plus ni surveillé ni entretenu. J'ai envoyé 16 lettres à différents ministres depuis 4 ans, sans résultat. J'ai aussi consulté des experts en recyclage de bateaux et proposé des solutions. Au lieu de faire comme les conservateurs et de nier qu'il y a un problème, est-ce que les libéraux vont enfin agir et déplacer le bateau? Bravo!
The Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another birthday. I'm proud to rise today on the 54th birthday of the Canadian Coast Guard. Yeah. I'd like to take this opportunity to say happy birthday to all the dedicated women and men of the Canadian Coast Guard. I want to reassure the member, again as I did yesterday, and the public, that at the moment the Catherine Spirit is not discharging any pollutants. I will be working, I have been working with my colleague and seatmate, the Minister of Transportation, to assess the situation, and will develop plans as we move forward. Thank you. Yeah.
Now the member for Toronto Danforth.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I rose in the House to talk about local food issues in my riding of Toronto Danforth. Canadians are concerned about the negative effects of consuming high levels of sodium and trans fats in their prepared foods. Can the Honourable Minister of Health please share with this House the government's plan to eliminate trans fats and reduce sodium in processed foods?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, as my colleague, the honourable member knows, I've been a family doctor and have had many patients who have suffered the devastating consequences of heart disease and stroke. And so it is now my duty as Minister of Health to work with all Canadians to reduce the prevalence of these conditions. We will do so in part by reducing trans fats and reducing sodium intake. My department, Health Canada, has already introduced mandatory nutritional labelling guidelines in order to reduce trans fats, and will continue to work with the food industry and all Canadians to improve the health conditions of all Canadians.
The honourable member for Oshawa.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government is hurting the manufacturing sector with their job-killing carbon tax, increased payroll taxes, and support for increased energy costs. They ignored the sector in their speech from the throne, and the Prime Minister has even been quoted saying that Ontario needs to transition away from manufacturing. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's unacceptable. When will this government do the right thing, quit interfering, and support the auto manufacturing industry so that it can create well-paying middle-class jobs in communities like Oshawa?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. As we know, this government recognizes that the automotive sector is a very important sector in Canada, employing almost 500,000 people. We will as we develop the government's innovation agenda, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work with our partners to build a stronger automotive and manufacturing sector in this country. Thank you very much.
Monsieur le Président, dans son rapport, la commissaire à l'Environnement est catégorique et je cite « L'Office national de l'énergie n'avait pas surveillé de manière appropriée la mise en œuvre des conditions d'approbation des pipelines, ni effectué de suivi adéquat des écarts de conformité des compagnies. Le suivi est défaillant. De plus, le projet Énergie-Est est rejeté par plus de la moitié de la population du Québec. Dans ces circonstances, le premier ministre n'a d'autre choix que d'assumer son leadership. S'engage-t-il à trancher en abandonnant ce projet ou va-t-il faire fi de la volonté de la nation québécoise?
Honorable ministre de l'Environnement.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai rencontré la commissionnaire comme l'a fait mon collègue, Monsieur CARR, le ministre CARR. Le Comité national sur l'énergie nous a indiqué qu'ils acceptent les résultats du rapport et sont en train de mettre en place des solutions. Merci.
Je rappelle aux collègues qu'il ne faut pas mentionner le nom d'un ministre, ni le ministre et le nom, mais seulement son ministère. L'honorable député de Montcalm.
Monsieur le Président, lorsque la Colombie-Britannique dit non à Northern Gateway, on les écoute. Quand les Américains disent non à Keystone XL, on les écoute. Mais quand 82 villes représentant 4 millions de Québécois font leur devoir et disent non à Énergie-Est, on nous insulte, on nous méprise, on nous menace. Quand est-ce que le premier ministre va enlever son chandail d'arbitre pour gagner du temps? Quand ce gouvernement va-t-il enfin comprendre que le projet de pipeline de Trans-Canada au Québec, c'est non?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr.
Speaker, it would be interesting to compare the positions from the three parties opposite to what we are advocating, which is to consult Canadians about a process that will lead to these major projects that are important for the future of the Canadian economy, to carry the confidence of Canadians without trying to divide Canadians by sector, by region, or by politics.
Oh.